Okay, I'll do the admin and then I'm going to kick off with just introducing you to Farah, who's of course our guest of honor here today. As I mentioned, I'm Bronwyn. I'm based in South Africa. I've hosted a lot of these, particularly around authors with interesting, provocative books. Obviously, known Anna for a very long time. The Intellect's been a wonderful place to connect with people like we are here today, all across the world. It is supposed to be a casual, free conversation. Because Farah is a special guest and an author, the session may be recorded. I don't have control over that as the host. I'm just here to keep the conversation going. So if that affects your, ironically, free speech in this space, take that notification as it is, moderate as it is in terms of how much you want to share of your face and of your ideas. But it should hopefully be quite a comfortable conversation where we all get to ask and answer the questions that we have. This is not a performance. It's not me interviewing Farah and you watching passively. The intellect conversations are supposed to be exactly that, conversations. So I encourage you to interrupt. I might even interrupt myself or Farah to get you involved with the conversation. Raise your hand if you're feeling more polite, but I'm also very comfortable for you just to sort of butt in and keep the conversation going kind of French style. But we're here to talk about free speech and the limits thereof. And maybe we can start with just a very literal raising of hands without using the sort of tech tools here as to who's actually read any of Farah's work on the subject. I know you put a few links in and there's a new book coming out. Have any of you engaged with Farah's ideas before, or why are you here? So are you here for the person, for the man himself, or for the ideas that you want to interrogate? I see there's a thumbs up over here. I've certainly I've had a chance to read the latest book, and I've certainly got some questions that I have, some of the things that I feel more and less comfortable about, and I'm sure you have your own ideas too. But I'll pause there for now and ask Farah to introduce yourself the way you would like to be introduced these days. And can you also, as a part of that, just for those who aren't familiar with your work, who haven't necessarily read the book that you've written, just tell us a little bit about your professional journey there too, the works that you're most proud of and the work that you are currently taking on the road.
Delighted to be here. Let me just start by saying I'm very sorry. I'm actually on my phone right now. I've had a major IT disaster. My computer is completely died. And that also means I have a hard out at 12 o'clock. I need to go and rescue this urgently. But meanwhile, I'm delighted to be here. I'm a professor at Princeton University. I'm a senior research scholar and I teach there. I am, by training, a historian of the English-speaking world, but in this book, I have taken a global approach to this big question of the history of free speech. And I came to that really from my previous book, which was called The Origins of Sex, a history of the first sexual revolution. It's a history of how our modern ideas about sex, and particularly the idea that sex is a private matter and that people, consenting adults, should be allowed to do what they like with their own bodies, how that idea, which is actually quite a recent idea, came about and what its influence has been in the world ever since it was invented about 300 years ago. When I went around the world talking about that book, I soon encountered all sorts of funny or interesting or thought-provoking instances of censorship, of no platforming, the rest of it. I mean, talking about sex in public is always slightly awkward and it is different in different cultures. And so that's understandable, but it also raises questions about why those norms are different in different places. And then as a part of that, I also traveled to China about 10 years ago because my book was translated into Chinese. And that was really particularly eye-opening because the book itself was censored in various ways. But more than that, when I traveled around China, I realized what an extraordinary apparatus of censorship the Communist Party dictatorship was putting into place to regulate the thoughts and speech of the Chinese. And That was particularly striking 10 years ago because it was still a moment at which we all in the West tended to believe that the internet was a force for good, a force for progress, a force for freedom, that it would liberate not only people's minds, but entire cultures. And the idea, which many Western policymakers and American presidents on down fervently believed, was that allowing the internet to spread in China would liberate that culture socially, economically, mentally as well. And what I found already 10 years ago, which is then striking, now everyone will understand what I mean by this, is that the Chinese were winning the war against freedom and the internet. They were rolling back any possibility that this technology would be liberatory with a whole series of mechanisms of censorship. So as a historian, I was fascinated to find that here was a culture that was using every single tool of censorship ever invented through history at the same time and inventing new ones as they were going along in the middle of a technological revolution. And I came back from that completely horrified. I thought, this is a dystopia that no one wants to live in. I believe in free speech. We all believe in free speech in the West. Around the world, really. It's a slogan that everyone can agree to. And yet, where does this idea come from? And why can we never agree? If we all agree that free speech is a good thing, why can we never agree on exactly what it means within our cultures, within our national cultures, and indeed internationally? What it means is very different in different countries. And I knew as a historian that the answer to that is a historical answer, because I also knew that for most of history, people didn't believe in free speech in the way that we do now. They didn't think that this was automatically a good thing. They didn't have the same ideas about it that we now do. So I started digging into that. It's a fascinating story. It's full of unexpected surprises. And I tried to write about it in a way that explained the giant mess that we now find ourselves in every national culture and across cultures around the world. So if you're interested in that, please do read the book.
Yeah, put the live link, the best place for people to get it. We've got people all across the world here, so I'm not sure what's my
example. Do that. I'm now just struggling with my phone. I
will have a look myself then.
Penguin Random House around the world. If you're in North America, it's published by Harvard University Press. It's called "What is Free Speech? The History of a Dangerous Idea."
That's one.
There you go.
Does anyone have a question they want to get started with? Because as Farah said, we might have to cut this a bit shorter than we had expected, so I don't want to take up too much space. So I'll give you the first shot. Anyone here? Mary, your hand went up first. First hands first. What do you want to put Farah on the spot about?
I don't want to put Farah on the spot at all. I was just kind of like, for me, the really interesting thing is who decides what disinformation or something unacceptable is, and how do you decide that? Like, if you're living in that dystopian society, what does that mean? And then going backwards and thinking, in any society there's a power structure, and therefore isn't all of our free speech biased anyway?
That's a really good question, Mary. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. And the book is partly, that's a major theme in the book, that the slogan free speech is just that. It's a slogan. It's never been possible to make this into a very coherent doctrine because it's incoherent in various ways. We can talk about that more if people would like to. But it's a slogan that has been often used by the powerless to advance their causes, to speak up, and that's why we celebrate it even today. Mainly, we think everyone has the right to speak their truth, and that's a good thing. But it's also throughout history, from the very outset, been weaponized by those with power to silence others. And so, free speech is never just about what the words are that people are allowed to say. It's also always about who is speaking, what is the audience, what is the medium, what is the intention, etc. Anyway, those are very interesting reasons and questions and historical developments that explain why in the present we are in such a mess. But back to your simpler question, which is who should decide what misinformation is or disinformation. So I think for this we need to just break down the question a little bit. One good thing to start with is there are different kinds of speech in the world, and there are different. For that reason, we should also be distinguishing different kinds of free speech, and that depends on what the aim is of the speech. For example, humor or art or literature, those deserve very great freedom of expression. But the aim of humor is not to, to develop and advance the literal truth. It's the very opposite. It's to poke fun at things, to make you laugh, to amuse you. Similarly, the aim of art and literature is not necessarily truth in a literal sense. And so the rules of speech, rightly, for those kinds of forms of speech should be different. They should attend to whether this is funny, whether it makes you think, not whether it's literally true. On the other hand, in political discourse, if we're talking about, people, for example, standing for election and seeking political office and power, then truth actually is very important. Literal truth is important. If we allow people just to lie and bullshit and spread untruth as part of political discourse, that is going to pollute our debate in a way that leaves it very problematic. And so that's one very important question. Now, say we have a forum for political discussion. The next point to try to agree on is that there is a difference between truth and lies, that there are certain things that are clearly untrue and that are harmful. So that the criterion here is not offense, it's not anything personal, it's actual harm. So we might distinguish as political societies kinds of speech that we as a society agree are harmful. Now, every society differs on this. Most societies around the world believe that it's harmful to their society and to political debate to allow people to spread dehumanizing, offensive untruths about whole groups. To say that, for example, that particular racial groups are inherently inferior, or that women aren't as intelligent as men. Things like this. This is a political judgment, but it's also an importantly historical.
Or all of Europe.
What's that?
All of Europe.
All of Europe. Most cultures do believe, and this comes out of history.
Yep.
We know, historians know, most people should know, that through history, and people back in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries knew this all too well, if you allow untruths to spread and slanders about whole groups of people and demonize them as less human or unhuman, then what follows is bloodshed and victimization and pogroms and massacres. We've seen this time and again in history. We see it in our own day in Rwanda, in Myanmar, in Burma, and of course in Europe. We saw it throughout the 1930s and 40s, and the Holocaust is a prime example of that. And so the laws that exist in Europe come out of that historical recognition and their attempt to limit harmful speech of that kind. Okay, so if you have that as a principle, then you can make laws that try to restrict the spread of this kind of harmful discourse in public political debate. Now, the advantage of that is that you're trying to keep the space of politics and political debate open for the kinds of speech that we think politics should be about. That's, say, reasoned argument about issues, not untruths and slanders and demonizing of other people. The downside is once you make laws of any kind, they can be weaponized. That's a problem with laws in general. And we see that all the time with laws about speech. So there's no perfect answer here. That's one of the sad but important lessons of my work, that we all want the laws about free speech and the norms to be simple and straightforward and not to think about this all the time. But I'm afraid that's impossible. That's not how communication works in the world. And we are stuck with a problem that if we make laws, they can be weaponized. If we don't make laws, then all sorts of other equally serious problems start to flood in: misinformation, demonization of people, and so on. Anyway, I'll stop there. That's a great question. Thank you, Mary.
It is a great point. I'd also like to sort of come in there a little bit and push a bit deeper, because everything you said there makes sense from an ethical perspective, that a polite society, that a good society, that a good family even would have certain norms, and maybe they'd be enforced in certain ways, and there's certain things that we do and we don't do because we want to be nice to each other and want to live a nice life. But I know that these conversations often get derailed about difficult, interesting issues when sooner or later someone brings up the Nazis, but you already did. And I thought that was an interesting point to look at, where we talk about, like, we do know historically, factually, that demonizing certain groups does lead to terrible things. There are plenty of cases in history that can show that escalation. But I'm not entirely convinced that regulating speech actually prevents those things from happening. In fact, even in the case of Nazi Germany, that speech was not actually allowed. It was not encouraged, and there was harsh penalties for saying the sorts of things that led to the eventualities that we all know happened. So
I'm not sure what you're saying here. You're saying that speech against Jews was not permissible in Nazi Germany?
No, I'm saying it was not permissible. I mean, they went to jail for hate speech. Like, hate speech laws happened.
That's actually not true. That's actually not true.
There were penalties. It was not free. It was not free speech. Like, how would limits have actually challenged that? Because there's always limits, as you say, and yet things still happen anyway. Does regulation of speech actually work to prevent bad speech from harming society, is the question.
Well, as I said in answer to the previous question, it's a hard question, and I go into this in my book. I mean, the book is a work of history. If you want to find out how we ended up where we are and where we might go next, then it's absolutely the best thing to read. If you want simple answers, it's not going to help you, because there are no simple answers. So this question that we've got into right now is about what we now call hate speech, and what people in the past often called group libel. And I'm afraid there are no good answers here. There are basically three models in the world of how to deal with what we call hate speech about whole groups. The first is the American model, which is no laws, no rules at all. It's not going so well in the United States right now, if you think about it as a model for reasoned political discourse. So the way in which in America anything goes leads to a political discourse that is uniquely unserious, untroubled by rationality, and also incredibly racist, and the rest of it. So if you want that, then to make no laws. It's not a great solution in terms of having healthy political debate. At the other extreme is what has evolved in India and Pakistan and other cultures that used to be under British rule, where they have a very, very, very trigger-happy definition of speech that's not allowed about whole groups, and that is that if anyone feels personally offended, not just by writing, but actually by verbal utterances, they can invoke the state to punish that. And that's a terrible model as well. In my book, I explain how this comes about, but it can be hugely weaponized by groups against each other. So that's also not a good model. In between is what we might call the European model, where really this is about political statements by the state, by the society, to say certain kinds of speech we think are impermissible because they denigrate particular groups, and that undermines their dignity as equal citizens. So this is about upholding the idea that all groups in society have an equal dignity as citizens, and that if you go around allowing people just to say black people are inferior, Jews have no real home in this country, etc., that is undermining their dignity as citizens, not treating them equally. And because these are political judgments about which groups deserve this protection, it's usually minority groups that are singled out as deserving this protection. Now, I said already, and I'll repeat it again, this is an attempt to make a political statement. It's an attempt to keep the bounds of political discourse focused on what really matters, but these laws can be weaponized. Their implementation is very, very problematic. If you go after someone for racist speech, you are going to amplify their prominence in society. They're going to call themselves a free speech martyr. It happens all the time. So I'm not saying this is a solution to anything, but I'm trying to point out how in the world today we've come to have these different models, what the pros and cons are of each of them. If you have rules, you can focus on debating, what is harmful and what is not harmful. I think that's, on the whole, a better approach than just shouting back and forth about free speech and censorship. But the problem is, again, once we have these eruptions of, are you allowed to say that? Is he allowed to say that? Is that against the law? People just start shouting about free speech and censorship. We get distracted from the underlying issue, which is it harmful in a society to say that people who are Muslims are not fully equal citizens, or that they follow a religion that is inherently against the core ethos of the society? Those are problematic political questions, but those are the ones we should be focusing on.
Anyone with a question or a comment? Because we're certainly not going to resolve the world's issues as to who can say what.
I would love to.
In a 60-minute conversation on the internet.
Yeah.
But the real challenges on everything that you're saying are like the boundaries and the definition, even of what speech is. Like some of the examples you use in the book are things like, for example, the sharing of pornography has been determined to be a free speech issue, right? So
Right.
our definitions of speech and how it is used have been stretched to the limits, which often doesn't help further the conversation. But at the same time, the core that I think many people do agree on is the rights to free thought, which you also come up with in the book. Like this
Absolutely.
thing of free speech, when it first started being spoken about in terms of liberties and rights, which are kind of agreed to and upheld by society, a lot of the discourse was around how speech is sort of an extension of thought, which is again coming very much full circle at the moment with the latest sort of advents of like Apple, for example, buying their sort of whisper technologies that micro predict speech, and how that's of course going to fall into the net again of our whole free speech and free thought discourse again. So you kind of like becoming sort of back full circle there as to, are there sort of common cause that we still actually agree on, that what should be free? Should thought be free, or should thought be policed? I mean, again, like this week we had the UK, again, not to pick on Mary too much. I think the UK government is now looking at building sort of predictive policing models based on children's speech in schools and on social media to predict their likelihood of future crimes, and putting them onto sort of lists and things. So, we're getting pretty close on both sides. We're stretching the limits of reasonableness coming and going at the moment. And we probably do need some sort of urgent discussion on the basics, which is becoming harder because, as you've said, like truth still is out there. But even that statement is up for debate at the moment. We've had these conversations before where there are quite a lot of people these days who are pushing back on the ideas of truth, and truth having been relative and facts becoming more personal. But you can't have productive discussion about what should be a right, what should be a norm, what should be a liberty, unless you can sort of agree on the terms of battle, like what speech is, where that line kind of falls. And I don't know if you have any comment on that, on the research you've done, obviously going all across the world, across all different parts of history, as to how those definitions themselves have also been manipulated into ceding and gaining space in this regard. And a lot of what you talk about in the book is exactly that, how free speech debates have been used for political ends to further certain interests, kind of agendas. But the definitions themselves, how do they sort of fit into this? And where have they been stretched and contorted into the most obviously sort of manipulable kind of points?
A huge number of questions. Let me just try and pick up. I mean, my book is a book of history because I do believe this is a question there where if you approach it just legally or philosophically, we're never going to come up with any answers. We're never really going to understand why we're exactly in the mess that we are. So let me take this actually at a tangent. One of the most important revelations of the book, themes of the book, that pertains to the mess we're in right now is that we all think of free speech as essentially a matter of two opposing forces. On the one hand, the individual and their freedom of thought and expression, and on the other hand, governments, states, power of states. And those are very important, of course, but if we only think of it in those terms, then we're missing something very important. And people, so the modern idea of free speech, which is the idea that every citizen has the right to speak out on matters of public concern, that only really is invented in the 18th century. So it's only about 300 years old. And quite soon after it becomes invented, first everyone's like, yes, liberty of the press, it's great, it's fantastic. Quite soon after that, people start to see that actually it's a little bit more complicated than that. You don't need to just think about the individuals on the one hand and the government on the other hand. You need to think about the media in the middle, the power of amplification. What decides ultimately which ideas and which voices are heard in any society more than others, and which force decides which are less important? Well, that's about mass media. In the 18th century, that was newspapers and periodicals. Over time, every single media revolution has brought about a shift in what is most powerful. But already in the 18th and 19th century, people could see that the mass media did not exist, newspapers did not exist to advance truth, to develop political discussion, all the things that free speech is supposedly for. They didn't exist for that. They weren't incentivized to pursue that. On the other hand, what they do clearly exist for is to make money, to sell advertising, to increase the power and the profits of their owners. And that's a problem. There's a tension between the incentives of the media and the supposed purposes of free speech. And out of that realization came a very long and very sophisticated critique from, on the one hand, on the left wing, socialists and communists who say, well, this is all about money and the capitalist system of media, and we need to find ways of rebalancing that so that the voices of the people and the voices of the less wealthy have equal play in this society, but also critiques from the right. Many conservative thinkers think this is equally a problem. And one of the fascinating things is that we've completely lost sight of this because of the way that our most recent current communications revolution has unfolded. So if you look at it historically, through the 19th and into the 20th centuries, that realization about the power of the media leads governments everywhere, including in the United States, to rethink what free speech should really mean. And most powerfully, they rethink it as needing also to involve the rights of the public more generally, the rights of the public to truthful information and the responsibilities of the mass media to think about the public and not just to make money. And out of this comes a whole rethinking of the First Amendment in the United States. And indeed, it feeds into, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is essentially an American document more than any other culture. Eleanor Roosevelt, the great champion of it, is part of this rethinking of what free speech should mean. And if you look at that Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, 49, They say the right to free speech on the one hand, so a number of things about it that are distinctive. First of all, this right can never be used to undermine the rights of others, can never be used to harm the public good. And secondly, it involves also the right to freedom of information. That's how people thought of it at the time, which means the media should be transparent and as neutral and professional as possible, and not just, out for profit and partisan gain and the rest of it. We need good, responsible media. Out of this movement also came then in the 1940s and 50s and 60s and 70s a tremendous kind of effort by responsible mass media themselves in newspapers, in broadcasting, in television and radio, and Americans in the forefront of this, at professionalizing and fact-checking and making sure that they are living up to the responsibilities that their great power gives them. And the tragedy of our most recent communications revolution is that this leads then into the 1990s when this new technology, the internet, comes along at a moment of peak belief in free markets, that free markets will solve everything. And so the legislation underpinning the internet doesn't presume that there's any need for public oversight and gives, as people maybe know, this tremendous power. There's a section of the law of the internet in 1988, section 240, that says, on the one hand, internet providers have the right to censor whatever they like of anything that people post through them. On the other hand, they have no responsibility for anything that's posted at all. So they have complete carte blanche. They're completely absent any responsibility for what they post and for their power. And that's led to a situation where the legacy media, as people now sneeringly call them, with all their kind of responsibility and their fact-checking and their desire to serve the public good, have basically been overwhelmed and put out of business by a model of information broadcasting, and especially in social media, that doesn't think about these things at all anymore. And we're all complicit in this. But the idea that free speech should mean anything more than just my right to say whatever I like, and the government's role, either for good or for ill, to step in or not to step in, is a terrible, historically ignorant way of thinking about it, which has lost sight of this long trajectory of understanding that the media are really important. So in the world today, we shouldn't be obsessing about, individuals saying things that are racist or harmful or whatever, or spreading misinformation about any kind. People are going to do stupid things and say stupid things all the time. The real problem in the world today is that the mass media, that are now more powerful than any other previous iteration of mass media in the world, namely social media companies, mainly American social media companies, take absolutely no responsibility at all for their immense power at amplifying certain things and suppressing others. I mean, Mr. Musk is a great example of what happens if you just let the free market and capitalism run your public discourse. It's a disaster.
Farah, I think that was a great summation of kind of the evolution. I think there was one stage in this in the United States that you may have skipped over and should have properly maybe observed, and that is that even before the rise of the internet and eventually social media and the complications and the challenges of managing and regulating that, in the 1980s, under the Reagan administration, the federal laws were changed and the regulation of the media were changed.
Yes.
And what happened is that essentially they eliminated the equal time requirement, where opinions should be equally shared and expressed. But that wasn't the only thing that was changed. I mean, they allowed the ownership concentration. But this really had an enormous impact, as I can see you recognize, in terms of radio and the rise of talk radio and right wing, essentially stations that were entirely dedicated to expressing only, conservative right-wing points of view, presenting right-wing facts and interpretations of reality, interpretations of government policy. Um, from my political point of view, and for many others who would agree with me, that was a disaster for the United States because that established, that almost set the playbook in a sense for the emergence of Fox TV and its essentially alternate reality, an alternate set of facts. Anyway, I've said enough, but
You're quite right. Sorry, is it Jeff?
yeah, yes, it is.
You're quite right. And this is the tragedy of doing an hour's conversation when I've written a 300-page book. It's all in the book. You're quite right.
Mm-hmm.
There's a much more nuanced and detailed and important chronology of how we get from 1948 to the present, and the Reagan years are very important. And indeed, cable television is another stage that is part of the trajectory that you're rightly outlining. Yeah, and Americans often say, well, we can't let the government decide what speech should be permitted. But I think, again, that's a very short-sighted and naive and simplistic way of looking at it. What we need, and which countries around the world try to have, and indeed the United States had with the FTC in its original conception, is arm's length bodies that are not the government, that are not partisan, that are bipartisan if you need them to be, but that regulate in the public interest for the public good, and then try and achieve diversity and fairness and viewpoint neutrality and the rest of it. And those bodies come under tremendous political pressure if you don't set up your democracy to adequately protect them. And that's what we're seeing in the United States right now. And every single independent source of authority is under attack because we have a would-be autocrat and a movement that is taking its cue from what's happened in Hungary and India and other places where, basically people, and the irony, of course, is, shouting free speech all the time, that they stand for free speech and they're against censorship. It's the worst kind of censorship we've ever seen in this country.
I don't want to monopolize the dialogue, but if I could just, share one last observation, which is, ironically, of course, what's happened in the US is that now we actually have the worst of all worlds because we have people who are controlling communications, directing, essentially deciding what's permitted, what's real, what's true, and they control both sides of the dynamic. So they're protecting the social media, the sort of, and promoting the idea on social that every point of view is legitimate in social media, although of course, identifying and doxing and penalizing, right? Penalizing opposite views that they don't like. But at the same time, they're taking what's left of the old liberal democracy regulatory system and using that to punish, media organizations and frankly, free speech, period, anywhere in private corporations, et cetera. It's a complete catastrophe.
It's an international problem now as well, because these American libertarian, very greedy and rich social media companies also control political discourse everywhere else in the free world. And the moment that they are faced with any kind of, tiniest bit of regulation from those societies that don't believe that they're necessarily acting in the public good all the time, they cry censorship, and they cry, they wrap themselves in the American flag, and they call on the power of the administration to come down hard to avoid having any kind of regulation imposed on them at all. And this is a really titanic battle that's playing out now in Europe, especially because the Europeans have put in place fairly sensible regulation that all it says is, social media companies, tell us what your rules of amplification and censorship are, and show us that you're implementing those fairly. That's all they're asking them to do. It's not coming in and saying you can't do this, you can't do that. Even that is too much. And in Brazil, that's the other place where they're trying to implement laws to safeguard political discourse from being just overwhelmed with bullshit and misinformation. And again, Americans are fighting back hard against that in the name of free speech, but really for profit and for, advancing often libertarian right-wing political movements that the current administration happens to like. Anyway, thanks for your great comments.
Carry on.
Thanks, Bronwyn. Well, I did get to manage to read most of your book. Just ran out of time to finish it. I found it very thought-provoking and stimulating, really enjoyable. My takeaway, I think, is a much more of a broadly philosophical one. And I've long been somewhat cynical about the meaning of the word free. And in the context of free markets are never free, they are constructed. And I came to very similar conclusions about speech. Because I think what's really important when we think about speech is our reference group. No human is an island. We are communal creatures. We live in, and even in a small community, there's going to be some level of social censorship.
Mm-hmm.
So really, to me, the interesting question is scaling up that level of censorship, and that really just speaks to politics and power of access to communication channels and how that's controlled. So really my takeaway from all of this, it all really comes down to power again. The other idea that I found very intriguing was how you get the sort of stratification of society, where there are people within society who are quite sophisticated, have access to a lot of information, education, etc. And then you get the masses who operate at a far more simplistic level, and are far more susceptible to influence and maybe react more emotionally and are less nuanced. And I mean, we see examples of this all the time. And then again, it's a very interesting question of who controls the access to the public megaphone. So to me, a lot of this really comes down to power. I think the word freedom is perhaps misleading. I don't think there is such a thing as true freedom. It's where do you sit in the pecking order? Where do you sit at what level do you sit, and how do you regulate and have access to the information that flows? And I think that's all it comes down to.
Well, I think you've touched on a lot of really important points. Sorry, my phone is about to die as well. I think we'll manage for another 5 minutes. The one thing I'd add to that, which is very interesting just intellectually, even though it's disastrous socially and politically, is the communications revolution of the internet and how that has changed communication. Because you rightly started by saying something like, we are always communicating with each other. Speech, if we think of speech as, just a personal action, we spend our lives speaking, and speech is always an action. Right? Speech is always intended to make something happen in the world, if only just to make someone else understand something. And so the idea that free speech is separate from action is another kind of philosophically very problematic notion. But anyway, it's always an action. And in our daily face-to-face lives with people that we know, we manage pretty well all the time the incredible nuance of the fact that what you say is always dependent on how the other person receives it. Meaning is shaped by context, by intention, by reception. Sometimes we get it wrong. Everyone is familiar with the situation where you say something and it goes down really badly, and you say, "Oh, I was just joking." And you do that because everyone instinctively knows the rules for jokes are much more wide and you have more latitude. Anyway, so there are all sorts of ways in which we are constantly calibrating the norms of discourse in our daily life. And as you rightly say, when you start to scale it up, that's when it becomes complicated. Now, in most media, mass media of the past, what you've had is someone able to magnify and amplify their speech, and for that to be received passively by giant audiences, whether in print or in radio or in film or in television. But what we now have is a completely unprecedented situation on social media, where literally millions of people can pile in on the same conversation. And that's, I mean, one explanation for the rise of what people call cancel culture and these endless kind of problematic explosions of anger and the rest of it about, really trivial, small amounts of speech, is that in this culture of online speech, everything that all the cues that we are able to understand from face-to-face communication are lost. And we know there's a lot of very good work about how people behave differently when they're sitting behind a keyboard, talking anonymously, from how they would behave if faced with another actual human being. The level of aggression, the inhibitions are much less, the rest of it. So that's another reason why online speech and battles over free speech and so on have exploded to the extent that they have, and the difficulty of dealing with that. And a final one I'd make is that it goes back to the point about, I was just joking. We all can understand that when we're engaged in interpersonal speech, it's serious, or it's joking, or it's, we understand the terms generally. We work very hard not to misunderstand each other. But in social media, every kind of discourse is jumbled together. Jokes, serious conversation, amusement, and that makes it very difficult then to make sure that everyone is understanding things in the same way, just as a baseline. Again, that's often in the background to episodes of anger about something that someone has said and piling on and so on. Anyway, thanks for your great intervention. Bronwyn, I'm afraid I've got 1.5 more minutes left.
Okay, well, I'll end with one question then. And then, of course, if you want people to connect with you afterwards, let me know if I can share any details of where they can find you or any blog that they can keep on reading. Just if you want to promote anything, I'll let you do that.
The book. I would love people to read the book.
Buy the book. I put the link to the book in the chat. You got it there. There you go. You heard it. But to close off with, there was one question that sort of comes back to the points around the sort of the bleeding definitions of freedom of speech. I think is quite topical. I don't know if you all know, but the one of the UN special rapporteurs, Francesca Albanese, was debanked globally for the comments that she made around the war in Gaza, which is obviously a huge freedom of speech issue. But I thought that was really interesting because it was a freedom of speech issue that has resulted in a debanking issue. And there's certain discourse at the moment that says money is a form of speech. And it's quite interesting to see those two concepts colliding in a very real context, especially across borders, where even if where she lives, her speech is tolerated, but if another country it's not tolerated, it has de facto sort of implications here. And that's I thought an interesting way to sort of round off this conversation, because it touches on the borders of free speech across borders, across definitions, and where we're heading to in the future, how the stakes have now been raised, and the jurisdiction is no longer as neat as it used to be. I don't know if you have a comment on the future of speech, even though you are a historian. I know historians do have a perspective as where we're headed.
Well, absolutely, yes. I mean, I end the book. I started the book because I wanted to understand the present, and I end the book with looking forward to the future. I mean, it is a mess, and I'm afraid the first step is just to understand why it's such a mess and how we might move forward and rethink our premises, which are often too simplistic, on the basis of understanding that. So speech is an action. I think that's the one simple point that I want to reiterate in response to what you just said. And it's an action that is often about power, as earlier speakers have pointed out, and it's often in the world faced with other forms of power. This is the the point that you yourself were making, that expression is now coming up against money, but it's always been entangled with money, as the point about the media makes clear. So if you'd like to know more, please read the book. I can't solve everything for people, but I really hope that the book helps people think more clearly and more deeply about what free speech has been, is in the present, and might be in the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, and I hope your tech issues, your new surprises for the new Chinese year are easily resolved.
Me too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, everybody. If there's anything else you want to debrief here, the space is yours. I know our main guest has left the show, and I know I'm not half as exciting, but if there's anything you didn't get a chance to say or anything you want to share, I can stick around.
I did. I mean, one thing that's always interested me, if anyone has any thoughts on it, is the value of religious speech, and the fact that many cultures place a higher value on religious speech versus other kinds of speech. And just whether anyone had any thoughts. I might have to go and answer the door. But give me 2 seconds if someone wants to start.
Let's gather some more questions. Who else has got a question we want to share here?
I've got one about paternalism. Like, is this and the senior American official who basically talked about the downslide of democracy with the new rules in Europe, and this kind of suggestion that it was like paternalism, and I thought that was a really interesting kind of take on the whole thing.
Yeah, that is an interesting take, because again, words can be kind of twisted in every direction. I think there was also quite a big discourse not so long ago about coming out of, I think it was Switzerland, also talking about the limits of democracy because of the direct democracy, where they found that the government thought the people were making the wrong choices. Like, people had the choice over, like, say, climate policies in their neighborhood, and they were not making sustainable choices. And the government was like, there's limits of democracy there too, which I always think is so interesting, because it is this sort of balancing act between, and how all these terms, of course, get manipulated to whichever powers have whatever objectives at whatever point in time, and how difficult it is to regulate something like this, because regulation can always be used from the other side in the other way. And I suppose if there's one good thing that will come out of this season of the America show, is that it will get the liberal West to question whether its values are robust against the whims of elections. This is something that Africa and South America, I think, gets a lot more, because we've tasted politicians of different flavors. I think especially South America, they know your laws have got to be robust against both those extremes, because the pendulum's going to swing real fast in the other direction. So you've got to make sure that that law can survive the other guys wielding it. And I think a lot of the more sort of liberal societies have lived with the luxury for quite a long time of politicians playing by those norms, which suddenly you realize are only as strong as the sort of the tenuousness of society. So I don't know if that's very helpful, but I do hear what you're saying. It's we've got to figure that out. Hamish, you're back. Does anyone want to answer?
I am back. Bad news is the boiler is completely kaput, so now needs replacing. So I won't be having a warm shower anytime soon.
That is very bad news. As a South African, I empathize. We had 20 years of power blackouts, which are now being resolved and replaced by a water outage. So, choose one. Either way, we're not getting a hot shower. We might have power, but no water. Or you got water, but no power.
Yeah.
I hear you. Coming back to you, what was your question again? Let's remind everyone, where were we? Recenter? I think we lose.
I've just always found it interesting, the primacy of religious speech in many cultures, and this idea that it may have privileges that other forms of speech don't. I just wondered if anyone had any thoughts on that. I don't know if it's mentioned in the book in particular. I can sort of guess what Farah might think about that, because we did discuss some of the other forms of speech that are carved out by
Mm.
society to have special import, especially hate speech, as we were describing it. But religious speech has always interested me, because it's been such a prevalent, specialized or prevalent form of speech that so often had special rights all over the world, for so long.
And still does. I mean, like this is something
Yeah,
that
oh
always
yeah,
people always get surprised about. Like Europe still has blasphemy laws. You know, you can still go
yeah,
to jail for insulting someone else's sort of imaginary friends. Like this is a reality. But I think there's a reason behind that, and that the law and religion and societal control and power have always been very closely intertwined. And before we had like governments, we had religion that kind of ruled us. And to a large extent, the law itself, in how it's applied and how sentences are distributed, is not really about justice so much as it is about protecting society. So, because religion is so emotive, regulating speech around religion protects society against violence in a quite a linear sort of direction. So there's sort of a limits to speech are counterbalanced by increases in physical freedom for society, which is why I think societies have given a greater weight, even though it is not a matter of factual truth, it's a matter of opinion, just because of the effects on society. And Farah doesn't come at it from that point in the book, but he does have at the beginning, because he goes through the history of it, that the origins of free speech discourse started around religion, because religious speech was what got you hanged, you know, if you upset whoever was in charge, and sort of freedom against those sorts of punishments and speaking out were the sort of earlier parts of where free speech became a right. And thereafter, historically, where it came to the political realm, when politics sort of gradually replaced the role of religion in society as the way we kind of govern things. Because, you know, before that, we didn't really have rights. Rights were sort of made up as society and politics evolved.
yeah, yeah,
Which is
absolutely.
great.
Um, and and yeah, and it there is a uh prohibition on free speech in the Ten Commandments, right? So it's
Well, it
a
was
very
started right back then.
yeah, yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So it's an old underpinning of the underpinnings of our legal framework,
Mm.
um, in the Christian world, anyway.
Absolutely. But you get rights to it. Like the distasteful thing around free speech is that limiting certain rights give us certain senses of safety and protection.
Yeah,
And,
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
but it's not always the nice thing that gets you the nice results. I mean, I keep on having these conversations in Africa, working with the African think tanks about the future of Africa and the challenges and what's going on. And there's constantly people putting out books that Africa's problem is it doesn't have enough democracy. But you know, as an economist, when you kind of look at the data of which economies are growing, they're not necessarily the most democratic ones, you know. So you constantly left with these like the distinction between the right thing and like the right results. And also it all comes back to that horrible little reality that values actually do have a price. And are we prepared to pay the price? Because we tend to lie to ourselves that if you do good things, you'll get good things. But actually, good things have a price. And are we
Yeah,
prepared to pay it? And that's a very different question. And when you understand that, I mean, it's like growing up from being a child and seeing the world for what it is. But then you can make more sensible choices going forward.
yeah. And another area is copyright.
Mm.
So copyright is a limit on speech that the Americans are hugely enthusiastic about, right?
Mm. I won't talk about it because that's something that I've spoken out too much about, so I'll keep my opinions to myself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, I don't have too strong a view
Mm.
on it. I don't think myself, but what intrigues me about copyright is whether AI is a technological revolution that changes what copyright has to be. In the same way that other technologies have changed how we deal with rights to as we were discussing, different technologies lead to you have to think about the rights differently. And especially when it comes to speech. And my friend is a very senior copyright lawyer, and I have a discussion with him, a couple of times a year about this. And always end with the fact, well, the good news is, Adam, there's a lot more work for you to be doing. But it
Lawyers always
really
win.
it really intrigues me. That is a form of speech, and it might change a lot how we think about it in the next, decade or so.
Mary.
I want you to tell me more about paying the price for values in terms of your think tanks in Africa. Can you give us an example of something that you've come across that's been really interesting in terms of all that balancing for you?
Well, that's exactly it. Like in the African context, like continentally speaking, you look at the data, you look at which economies are growing the fastest and which ones are the most liberal, which have the strongest democracies. And the data does not show that more democracy equals greater economic growth. And that's a very good example of that, but it's quite big. I mean, it cuts across. Like Rwanda is, of course, a great example of like great economic growth, but what else has happened underneath the hood in terms of, people are still getting taken around by the back of the bushes. It's not a happy, hunky-dory democracy. Singapore is, of course, another story like that. It's not just Africa. Like these ideas that the package that was sold, we have these lovely ideas that democracy will solve all of our problems. But I think that's the wrong way to look at it. If we are justifying our values based on economic gains, we're not going to be left with very many values come the end of the day. And I see this also with like corporate work, where we're looking at things like diversity, equity, inclusion, and you're looking at ESG standards. And for a long time, corporate consultants tried to sell values, which is doing the right thing for people on the planet on economic terms. And there was a lot of conversation said that if you do the right thing, you're going to make more money. But that was never really the case. It's always kind of actually been the other way around, that if you have money, you get to choose what values you invest in. And that values do actually come at a cost, but quite often that cost is worth selling. And I think we've sold a lot of our values in the wrong way by selling them on economic terms. Because then when the money doesn't add up, we throw the values out with the bathwater instead of understanding that the value itself was what we were buying all along. So I don't know, that the free speech thing kind of fits into that too. Like, is this a value we want to have? And if we are, what are the prices we prepared to pay? How far are we prepared to pay for that? Or not? So it's like we just center it all, we always center it the wrong way around, and then we call it our pants down when someone puts up their hand in the hall and says, but wait a minute, this economy is doing great and they have a dictator. Like you can't make that argument. You stuck because you've come at it from the wrong perspective. Like isn't the actual ideal how long your children are living and how how safe your women are? Aren't these more important questions than your GDP? But again, that's up for debate, and that's a question. It's what is the price of your values? And I think democracy is one of those things that's actually a value, and seeing it as a means to an end is perhaps going to get us in particular trouble in this particular point in history as the center of economic gravity moves from west to east. That we're going to have to come up with a new set of stories. What do we value and what are we paying for?
That makes me think about the values posters on walls and businesses quite differently.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. It's basically like the old sort of prosperity gospel lie, like, the happy clappy churches that'll tell you, if you go to church, you're going to get rich. Like, that's not why you should be going to church. If you're going to church because you think it's going to make you rich, there are other things you could be doing. So, uh, so that's it's just a more sort of secular version of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if I could just echo on that, I've seen the same phenomenon here in the U.S. and it's certainly probably true in Europe as well and elsewhere, around the diversity, equity, and inclusion issue, which is, that was promoted quite a bit over the last 10 to 12 to 15 years in the U.S. as, part of a competitive advantage, right, for companies and businesses. And at the same time, it was also clearly justified on the basis of doing the right thing and making up for some past discrimination and penalties. But you would be surprised when things shifted here in the U.S. a year ago, and
Yeah.
suddenly, the federal government was punishing companies and institutions for
Yeah.
DEI. You would be surprised at the number of people. And a year ago, I was still working in um, recruiting and executive recruiting and so on and so forth. The number of people around me who sort of said, well, we never really found much evidence that it helped companies compete more effectively anyway. So is it such a great loss? Right. And I would sort of, shake my head like, well, okay, if you're going to look at it that way, fine. But, that's not the
Yeah.
only reason.
No, it'd be so cynical. I mean, like even like the multinational NGOs who said they're like redacting the word gender from from their plans so they could get aid. I mean,
Yeah.
people are people everywhere, but I think when we sort of muddy our ideals with our economic goals, we make very different choices that we would if we were to be clear about separating things.
Right.
They're not like fungible. You can't swap one for they're entirely different tracks. But anyway,
so Bronwyn, how has your approach changed by growing up and understanding that values cost?
I think I was brought up that way, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I was brought up by like Methodist volunteer preachers. Okay, so they were never sort of super motivated by money. I was always so I probably have a slightly different sort of perspective there, but also I did grow up in South Africa where we know about inequality and we know about privilege. And like I grew up like I was like how old was I? I think it was like 7 at the end of apartheid. So like, I grew up with that whole sort of change, being very aware and very told about what privilege and what value is from a very early age, which is a perspective that I'm very grateful for now. So I think that sort of awareness has sort of gone with me into the work that I've done, the strange sort of jobs that I've had, always being a kind of outsider consultant coming in on an independent basis into organizations. But it's been interesting to see people sort of catch up with that and sort of take these sort of the values and the privileges that come along, or the other way around, the privileges and the values that come along with privileges that are now being challenged in much of the Western world. Like Jet's just said, like these were things that we took for granted were goods until there was a squeeze and we were forced to reckon with the differences between goods and values, between price and value. And we didn't have to do that before because so much of the Western world was so privileged for so long. And that sort of reckoning is kind of happening now, and we're having to decide for ourselves what our actual values are. And again, the sort of very, very sort of personal South African context, you could tell some people didn't want to reckon with the values and the privilege, and they left. You'd immigrate. You're not going to play this new game. You're gonna go and you're gonna pretend that you don't have to sort of compete on a different sort of basis, or you got to stay and then you've got to figure it out. You've got to sort of re-justify those things. And we have. So in some ways, I think we're kind of ahead of the rest of the world in dealing with these questions, but they're coming. This is what scarcity, this is what reckoning, this is what challenges to our economics make us do. They make us reevaluate what it is that we're prepared to pay for and what it is that we're not, and what it is that we're prepared to protect. And also the understanding that you have to pick and choose your values, that like your values around equity or values around diversity and inclusion are going to be coming into conflicts with your values around freedoms of various different sorts, because all freedoms bump into each other. My freedoms bump into your freedoms. My economic freedoms bump into your social freedoms. You got to negotiate that space again. And I think it's interesting that the current last 2 years have, I think, forced a lot of the formerly privileged world to sort of start asking these questions anew, which is why this sort of book that Farah's put together makes so much sense at this particular time, because we're going to have to refigure this out now. And especially when you compare and contrast it to the East. I mean, China's the obvious example. They got a very different set of values and a very different set of prices they're prepared to pay for that, right? So it's a value clash that we're running into here at a sort of civilizational level. And none of these models are perfect because you can't have infinite freedom. You can choose which ones are important to you and defend them, but it's going to come at a price. And are you prepared to pay that price? That's the question. And then, of course, you had old Mark's speech from Canada, which was just, I'm sure everyone's been talking about that too, the Davos speech that the Canadian PM put out. And it was a speech about this, about like values of a rules-based world order are being replaced by pragmatism. We're not prepared to pay for that anymore because it's no longer serving our economic ends. I mean, he basically admitted that Canada had supported the rules-based world order because it made the money, and now that it's not making their money, they no longer support it. I mean, like, this is my take on it as an African. I know Europeans read it very differently, but nonetheless, this is where we are. It's the same kind of question. You got to figure out what you're prepared to pay for and what you are prepared to protect at any price when it comes to values. So that's way off topic. You're welcome to bring us back to where we're supposed to be.
I think I'm going to head off, guys, but it was lovely to join a salon for the first time in a while. And yeah.
Keep warm. I have sympathy as well as empathy for you, I promise.
Thank you. All right, cheerio, everyone.
Cheers.